This video is sponsored by Brilliant.org. What's up everyone, welcome back to the shop. Earlier this year, I filmed a bunch of videos to put together a series on how to make picture frames. Every little detail you could ever imagine, different tools, techniques. It was kind of a monumental thing for me, and I never released it. It was gonna go on my website with another class that I offer there, and I just never got a chance to do it. So what I've done is took all those videos, crammed them all together into this, and put it out to everyone. So this format is a little bit different than my normal videos, but hey, hopefully you enjoy it. So if you ever want to know anything there is to know about making a picture frame, this is the place. Let's start by making a basic picture frame. I know that this isn't the really cool, awesome looking frame, but we're gonna do that a little bit later on. Now, if you already know how to make a picture frame and you wanna skip ahead, then go for it. I figure that we need to go over the basics of making a picture frame so that way we build up our skills before we start going crazy with all these elaborate ones. There's two things that we gotta figure out first: the width of the frame that we want and the thickness of the material. Well, when it comes to the width, we look at our artwork. How big is our artwork? What do we want it to look like? Well, for this one, I'm gonna go with an 8x10 photo of Fitzy Boy, AKA the Savage. Since I'm using a rather small picture, I don't wanna have a big chunky frame, so I'm gonna go with an inch wide. To determine the thickness, we need to just basically add up all of our materials. So we know that we're gonna put a sheet of glass in there. Well, that's about 1/8 of an inch thick. Then you have the artwork itself. Well, in this case, it's just a photo, so it doesn't really matter at all. And then after that, we have the backer board, which is again, another about 1/8 of an inch. So you add those together, we're at 1/4 inch thick. I like to have a setback that's about 1/4 inch. That's from the front face of the picture frame, and it sets back before the glass actually starts. Some people like to go thinner, some people like to go thicker. So I add that in there along with the glass and the picture and the backer board. We're at 1/2 inch. I don't want my backer board to be flush with the back of the frame. I like to have a little bit of extra room so I can put a hook there. We'd hang the picture on the wall if we want to. So I want to add an extra 1/8 of an inch at least. Well, when I add those up, that's 5/8. So that means that I have to have a frame that is at least 5/8 thick. I'm gonna go ahead and mill up my lumber down to 3/4 of an inch thick because it's always good to have a little bit of extra material. We have to determine how much material do we really need for this project. Well, there's kind of an easy formula to use to figure out your rough estimate when milling it up. You take the width of your frame, which is 1 inch, and we double it. So that's 2 inches. Then we add in the side, the length of the side of the art. So if we're looking at a long side, that's 10 inches long because we're doing a 10x8 photo. So we had 10 inches plus the 2 inches makes 12. So you need 12 inches of material on one side, 12 on the other. So we're at 24. And then you do the same thing when it comes to the top and the bottom. Okay, we need 10 inches for the top, 10 inches for the bottom. It all adds up to 44 inches. I always like to add a little bit of extra. So I'm gonna go ahead and mill up lumber to account for 60 inches of material. I got a piece of walnut here that I'm gonna make this first picture frame out of. Now remember, you need 60 inches of material, or that's what I'm gonna use, but I don't need to have 60 inches all the way down. I don't need to have a 5-foot board. We can use all of this if we want to. So I'm measuring the width of this. I know I'm at 6.5 inches. That is plenty to get 4 1-inch stripes out of it. I'm gonna have a little bit of extra material left over, which is great. So what I need to do is account for 60 inches worth of material. Well, you know what? If I do 15 inches over here, I'll cut this part off. Each one of those is definitely long enough to do my longest side. So I'm gonna roll with that. So I need to cut this off, mill this portion down to 3/4 of an inch thick, and then cut 1-inch slices out of this. Now, we gotta talk about how we're gonna do the rabbet. Now, whenever you're making a picture frame, you have to either cut your rabbet before you assemble the frame or do it afterwards. I know that seems kind of like, yeah, of course, but it matters on the order of operations on how you do things. So you gotta decide ahead of time. I'm gonna show you both ways. One way, this picture frame that we're gonna do the rabbet first before assembly. Now, the other way to do it is you glue together the whole frame and you use the router table or a router with a rabbeting bit and route out the inside of it to give yourself that rabbet. Let's figure out how deep of a rabbet we need. Well, I told you I like to have about 1/4 inch step down before the glass starts. So if I've got 3/4 inch material, that means I need to cut away 1/2 inch. As far as the width goes, how far into the picture frame do we make that rabbet? That kind of depends on what your preference is. Generally, you want to have at least 1/4 inch. You could cut rabbets in a bunch of different ways. If you have access to a dado stack, well, that's gonna make this way faster. Oftentimes, I'll just make multiple passes using a ripping blade that has a flat tooth on it. Usually a crosscut blade will have alternating teeth, so you can make a cut with that, but then turn around and make a cut with a ripping blade and compare the two. What you'll see is that the crosscut blade usually has these little triangles in the corner compared to a ripping blade, which is really clean and squared off. I have some brass setup bars. These things are really handy. Definitely recommend getting a set of them. They don't cost very much. They come in a bunch of different sizes. So I have a 1/2 inch one. I can sit here and set my blade to about a 1/2 inch and also check it with a 1/4 inch one. Looks like that's about right. I can lock in my blade. So I have the ripping blade in there with the flat tooth right now. Next we can set our table saw. So I'm gonna move this over, just the tip of my blade over here on the extra side here. I don't wanna cut it like this where I have a lip over here on the side. I'm gonna start nibbling away like this. I'm gonna make a pass, bump my fence over a bit, make another pass, and do that until I've cut away a 1/4 inch. Now we gotta cut the miters for our picture frame. There's a couple ways to do this, just like with the Rabbet. First method is making a jig like this. Now I don't know that I would recommend making this jig if you only make one picture frame, but if you make a couple frames, highly, highly recommend making this jig because it rules out all of the math that is required to make a picture frame. Mine's already put together. I don't have a need for a second one, so I'm not gonna make one for you, but I am gonna put links down in the description of this video that explain how to make this jig, because if you make picture frames, you want this. This jig is a 1/2 inch thick piece of plywood. It has 2 runners that allow it to slide in the miter slot. Now, the main thing that really makes this work out really well is the aluminum square, because you can cut aluminum on a table saw. Make a cut through it and it makes a curve. We have an 8x10 picture. So I'm gonna put this at 10 inches, clamp it down. I make my cut, I move it over, I butt it against my 45-degree stop block here. I make my other cut, boom, it's done. Do that twice because we need 2 sides. Then I'm gonna take my block, move it over to 8 inches, clamp it down, do the same thing, and we should have a picture frame that fits an 8x10. I taped together my frame, so I just wrap some tape around the corners so that I can take this and make sure that our artwork fits inside it. It does. Fantastic, really happy with that. So now it is time to glue this guy up. So I find using a clamp like this, you can also find them with just straps, but a strap or a band clamp works great for this. This is a clamp by Merrill. It works really well at making sure that all of your corners are at 45 degrees. So you essentially put it on each corner, twist this to clamp it down, and you're good to go. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and apply glue to all of my miters, assemble the thing, glue it up, let it dry. While it's drying, we can start working on making some glass to fit inside this. Pro tip, put down some wax paper, keeps the glue off of your bench. I tend to apply glue in 2 phases. I will apply it and then go around and do all of my miters. And by that time, it should start soaking into the wood, into that end grain there. Then I apply another coat and then glue it together. I will take my joint and slide it. Gives a little bit of suction there, helps the joint stick together. Put some tape on this guy here. Now I know that these 2 points are right next to each other. I don't have a joint that's slid way over. And I'll do that on all 4 sides before clamping. Let's make sure it's square, dead on. Perfect. Okay, let's let this dry now. I got a sheet of glass here that I picked up from a big box store, so you can get this pretty easily at a lot of different places. So a couple things we need. We need our glass, a straight edge. I'm gonna use some double-sided tape. I'm gonna tell you why. We need our glass cutter. In this case, I'm using this really cheap one. This is a Husky one I got from the box store. It has a cutting wheel on one side and a ball on the other, and a little bit of oil. First thing that I'm gonna do is measure out how big I want this. Now, it is really difficult to take a fine cut off of glass. So that means opt for cutting a little bit smaller because if you make your glass a little bit oversized and you have that little sliver of glass left over and you're like, oh, I wish I could trim off like a 1/16 of an inch, it probably isn't gonna happen without breaking your glass. So I'm gonna put my ruler up here and mark it just under 1/8 of an inch. And I'm gonna do the same thing down on this side. Some double-sided tape is really handy with this, and the reason why is because I find that it is obviously easier to cut glass if you have a straight edge that you can write it against so you're not freehanding it. But over time, what I learned was I was breaking glass and I could not figure out what I was doing wrong. Why was I breaking so much glass? My straight edge was sliding a bit on me as I was trying to cut. It didn't seem like it, but this is a slippery surface. So, it was not working out for me. I'm gonna take my cutter, put it on my line, set the straight edge next to it. Same thing down here. Press this down nice and hard so this is not going anywhere. Put just a little bit, just a little drop of oil on there. Nothing crazy. Don't need to slather it or anything. We'll hold this down. Make one steady cut with pressure all the way down. We don't need to go crazy with it. Just one steady cut with pressure. And then we'll see if we can break this. Well, break it where we want to break it. Not, but we'll see. All right, we take the ball, put it down right on that cut line, and voila, piece of glass. So now I need to do the same thing and cut it to 10 inches. That will fit in our frame. The glue is all dry and those miters look great. No sorts of gaps in them, so I'm really happy with it. Well, now we have to decide on how do we reinforce this? Now, when it comes to reinforcing the miters on a picture frame, it is completely optional if you want to do that. The problem is, if you don't, and this picture frame falls, it will probably break. When it comes to reinforcing though, you either do it external or internal. So we either figure out a way to reinforce the joint when we're doing the glue up, or we do something afterwards. There's a couple options here. You can put splines in. That is the traditional way to do it, is we put splines in, and I'm gonna show you that way. Or you can come up with something a little bit unique. You could drill a hole or something like that and put some sort of peg or something in from the backside. But traditionally, what you would do is you would put in some sort of joinery inside it, a domino, a dowel, something like that, loose mortise and tenon into the joint as you're gluing it up. We're gonna do that on the next picture frame. This one, we're gonna do splines though. And to do splines, well, you kind of need some sort of little jig to help hold your picture frame in place. So let me show you how to do that. This is the jig that I have for making splines in picture frames. It's a pretty simple setup really. What it does is it rides on my table saw fence. So I'm pushing the entire jig through the blade and not having to have my hand down by the blade at all. So it's actually really safe to use. So what you do is you take your picture frame, you put it inside this, and you clamp it into place. And then you push the entire jig through. Now it's fairly easy to make. What it consists of is a box that wraps around the fence here. So pretty simple stuff. The thing is I can't give you exact measurements because everyone's table saw fence is a different size. Basically measure out the width of your fence and then make sure you have another block on the other side of your fence. So you want it as tight as possible, but you also want it to be able to slide back and forth. Mine's a little bit sticky because I haven't used it in a bit. So I'm probably just gonna put a little bit of wax on it and it's gonna be good to go. The front face here is simply just a piece of plywood that I had that I made sure was 90 degrees to my table. And after that, it's about making sure that you have one of these bars that is exactly at 45. So this is how you do that. I just have like a carpenter square here. I put it on my board, took a piece of plywood and just glued that on there. So I know that this piece is at 45 degrees. Once that is glued in place, you take a picture frame, you put it on this and slide it down until the tip of it is just close to the table. You know, I prefer not to have the tip riding on the table, maybe just a hair off of it, and then mark a line and glue another piece of plywood right over here. Now the great thing about this is it accommodates any size picture frame you want. I have done little frames like this. I've done tiny frames. The biggest one I did was 36 inches long. It was so big it was hitting the ceiling above, so I had to move my table saw over to a different area of the shop in order to be able to do this. What we're gonna do is put the frame into place, and I'm gonna clamp it down, and then we need to align it to the blade. We have to determine how big of a spline we wanna put in there. Now, the wider the spline, that means we're cutting further into our frame here. And then we have to account for, we did have this rabbet that we cut. I tend to want to cut my splines so that the blade is not getting higher than this corner right here. If you start cutting into this corner and you start cutting higher into that, your spline looks wider, and I think that's a really cool look, having the wide splines. But that means when you glue your spline in place, it's going to cross over this corner and your picture is not going to fit in there anymore. That's fine. You'd have to take chisels and chisel away this part again and make sure you get rid of that spline on the inside. I tend to just go, you know what? I'm going to put my spline so that it fits as close to this corner as possible. I can check to make sure that the height is okay by putting my picture frame in here, looking at the blade, making sure that it does not go higher than that corner. And once I know it's the right height, I lock down my blade. To determine where on the picture frame to cut, I shoot for the middle. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect because it's all going to be uniform. So what I do is put my picture frame in here and slide my table saw fence and the jig over until this blade is just touching my picture frame, and I can see if it is in the middle of my frame. That's what I'm shooting for. I am going to use a ripping blade to do this operation. Now, that does risk more tear out, but it also gives me that crisp cut that I want. If I use the crosscut blade, you get those weird little triangles. When you put your spline in place, you're gonna have gaps. To mitigate any of that tear out, I'm gonna put tape around my corners. Those look like some good looking splines that we made, at least the slots for the splines. I know that this is 1/8 of an inch wide because that's the table saw blade width that I have, the kerf of it. My goal is to get a piece of wood that will fit into this slot and be able to slide it back and forth. You don't want to be able to hammer it into place. If you do, it's not going to fit once you do glue up. Once you apply glue, the wood's going to start to swell a bit. And then you're gonna try to put that in there and it's not gonna fit. You're gonna try to hammer it, it's gonna break, it's gonna be a mess. So it's better to have it where it's just a tad bit loose. You put it in there, you should be able to freely slide it back and forth. You shouldn't have a lot of wiggle, but you should be able to slide it back and forth. Then you know you have the right thickness of your board. I mill down a piece of maple until it fits into my slots. It will slide back and forth, but it doesn't wiggle. So that is absolutely perfect. So I don't need all of this. I just need a little bit of it. So I'm gonna put it on here, take a pencil and draw some lines. Now I have a triangle. I'm gonna do the same thing down here. And I need 4 triangles for 4 miters. After I get all of these drawn, I go over to the bandsaw and simply cut on the outside of the line. Don't try to cut on the line. Don't try to get really close to it. You can cut away, pretty far away from this. You just need some sort of oversized triangle. Once we glue these into place and they're dry, we'll flush them up with the outside edge of our frame. So now over to the bandsaw. Okay, I got 4 splines or 4 corners. Now I do recommend dry fitting these in there and making sure that each one of them fits. Now it's time to glue these up. Nothing special here. Just put a little bit of Titebond glue on both sides of the spline, stick it into place, slide it back and forth to kind of get that suction, and make sure that it is pressed firmly down so you don't have any sort of weird gap where the spline is sticking up off the frame. That's it. I don't use any sort of tape or clamps or anything. You absolutely can tape and clamp these into place, but I find that once I get the glue on there and I slide it and it really starts to stick, it's good to go. You're gonna notice that with the splines, I made sure the grain was running sideways. So we have our joint this way. The grain is running opposite of that. That's on purpose because that is way stronger of a spline. If you were to take your board, this is the end grain and this was a long board, and you were to simply just stick it into the slot this way, well now the grain is running the same direction as your joint. And if this joint moves, this is gonna be way easier just to snap in half. So this is not a strong spline doing it this way. If you turn it to its side and do it, it's great. That's the way you want to do it. The glue is dry on the splines, so now we need to clean these up. There's a couple ways to do this. Now, one way is you get a flush trim saw like this. This is a Japanese pull saw, flush trim saw. This one works really great. You can also get something like this. This is just one from DeWalt, and we basically just ride it along the edge of this frame and slowly saw that away. So we can do that on one of them, and then I'm gonna show you a different way to do the same thing. If I'm gonna cut this spline off right here, just take my saw and ride it right up against the edge of that frame and just slowly cut away at it. While that method works great, I prefer to do it like this and just sand them away really quick. Makes it really, really fast to do. And well, I gotta sand the frame anyway, so might as well. I sanded the frame with 120 grit and then 180 grit. And I definitely made sure that I hit the sides really good. That's where those splines are at. I wanted to make sure those were definitely flush and clean looking. And then I went ahead and hand sanded it all with 220 grit and made sure that I broke over all of the edges so everything feels really smooth. That's because I'm gonna apply an oil to this. I'm gonna use teak oil to this, a close to the wood feel. It's gonna be really good. Something about this just felt like it should be oil. Sheet of glass, artwork, and this is simply a piece of hardboard, or you could use particle board, really thin stuff, works perfect for backers. This is a point driver. It is fantastic at what it does. It is a one-trick pony. It drives points, that is it, but it does an excellent job. Now what that means is when we put our frame down, you can push this up against your frame, push the handle, and it drives a point into your frame, and it will hold the backer board into place. Now you can get these where the points are rigid, where they don't move. Once you put them in there, that's the way they are until you pull them out. Or you can get them that are flexible. The flexible ones allow you to bend them, pull your artwork out, change out your picture, put it back, and bend it back into place. I tend to go with the bendable ones. I found that the rigid ones tend to break, so I go with those. But I'll put 2 to 3 on each side. Usually the short sides I'll do like 2. The long sides I'll do 2 to 3, just until everything fits like it should fit. Now we have an incredible picture frame, walnut, maple splines, looks really good. Fitzy looks pretty cool in there too. For our next picture frame, we're gonna try some totally different techniques. Now it's also going to be a frame that holds an 8x10 photo, but let's build it in a different way so we can try different ways to do it. So I went ahead and milled up my pieces. So I did the same process that I did for the previous project. I got 4 pieces of cherry here. They are 3/4 of an inch thick and they are about 20 inches long. Way oversized for what I need, but I had a 20-inch long board, so I just sliced it up. So we have 1.5 inch wide pieces for this frame. So this frame is going to be a little bit wider, but that's okay because we're going to do some hidden joinery in this one. So instead of doing splines, we're going to hide the joinery, and then also we're going to cut the rabbet after glue up, which means we have to do kind of a weird calculation to make sure that we have the right size sides for our picture frame. We can't just simply use that really cool jig to do all the math for us. We got to do the math ourselves. Now, how long of a side do we need? Well, you can't just do the basic math of, well, double the frame width and add the side and you're done, because you have to account for adding that rabbet in later on. Otherwise, your frame's not going to be the right size. So here's the formula that you have to do. Double the width of your frame, add in the length of the side, subtract the width of your rabbet times 2. So when you do that, it comes out to 12.5 inches for the long sides, 10.5 inches for the short side. So that means I need to take this over to the table saw and cut miters so that the very tip of those miters, the longest portion of this, is 12.5. Do the same thing on the short sides, 10.5. I'm gonna do my miters here at the table saw. That's how I like to cut mine. Now you could absolutely use a miter saw for this. So if you've got a good miter saw and you could dial it in to 45 degrees, have at it. The way I do it is I take my miter gauge and my saw, I make sure that I set it perfectly at 90 degrees and calibrate it. It's all good. Set it to 45, check it again, make sure everything is good. Then I set my stop clock down and make my cut. So I'm gonna make one cut, flip it over, make the other cut, move on. Simple enough. My miters are cut. I put a little piece of tape on there to make sure that they all look good, and they do. So now, before glue up, we need to actually apply our joinery on the inside of it, right? Well, you could do a couple different things with this. A lot of times I'll throw in a domino, a loose mortise and tenon in there, but I also know that the domino is a very expensive machine and not everyone has one. So we're gonna go with an alternative this time, dowels. So I have here this really cool dowel jig. This is a 1/4. You can also get them 3/8 and 1/2 inch. Not very expensive at all. Really cool jig. And it has a slot for 2 different dowels. So you can put 2 dowels at a time. Now our frame is really narrow. You don't have room for 2 dowels. So we're just gonna do 1. And that's perfectly good for this right here because you're gonna have the gluing the miters together. You just need something there. So 1 dowel across that joint is plenty strong. So we need to mark a line across the joint so we can line up our dowel jig. Now we don't want to do the dowel too close to this inside edge because that's where we're going to put the rabbet at. We don't want to cut through the dowel. I mean, it's not the end of the world if you do, but it's better if you don't. I'm going to take a combination square, put it across my joint here, and then we're going to mark it. Now in this jig here and a lot of other jigs, they have guidelines that are on this acrylic piece here. So we put the acrylic line on the line we just drew out the hole. Now there's one key thing to this that you got to make sure that you remember, and that is don't drill too far and puncture out the side of it. Okay, so what I typically do is I will put my drill bit through, set it like this, and make sure that drill bit is not all the way through. And if it looks good, it's time to drill. All right, put a dowel in there and look at that. Nice tight corner there. The inside looks good. Cool, so now I need to do the other miters. Frame is dry, not too bad. Now, if you ended up having some sort of tiny little gap or something in your frame, not a big deal. It's all good. Take a little bit of glue and some sawdust and fill in those gaps. But this looks really good. Now we need to cut the rabbet on the inside face of our frame. I'm gonna use this. This is a rabbeting bit if you've never seen one of these. This one right here has multiple bearings that come with it. It comes in a set. You can buy them where they don't have a bunch of bearings, so you can buy different sizes. What you essentially do is just run it on the inside and the bearing runs against the frame and it cuts out the rabbet. So I'm gonna put this down into my router and my router table, put my frame up against it, run it around the whole perimeter, and we'll have a rabbet. Just like with the first picture frame, I wanted the rabbet to be the same. I wanted it to be a 1/2 inch deep and a 1/4 inch wide. But that's a lot to take off in one bite, especially with a router bit. So I snuck up on it. I cut a little bit away, raised the router bit up, cut a little bit away again, and kept doing that until I cut away a 1/2 inch. Now there is one big downside to using the rabbet bit, which is rounded corners. So how are you gonna put a piece of glass on there unless you're gonna round the corner of the glass? Well, that means we need to corner these and straighten these out. And that's just old school. We got a chisel, we got a mallet, we got to go to work. Here's how I do it. I take a fairly wide chisel and I know that this is the straight line, right? When it starts to curve, I kind of put a little mark there. And I start marking with my chisel until I get where I can do it on the other side and those lines are going to intersect. So I'm not eating away at it, I'm just kind of scoring the wood. Or you could do the same thing with a marking knife. You could take a straight edge and just make a mark. And just to score the edges there, and then we're gonna take the chisel and then chip away at the rest of it. We got 1 square corner, 3 more to go. Identical to how I did the last frame, I applied teak oil to it, let it sit overnight, and then put in my glass, my artwork, and my backer board. So no difference whatsoever from the last one. That is a beautiful looking frame. All right, this is the second frame now. We have tried different methods. We've done the Rabbet before we did glue up. We did the Rabbet afterwards. We've used external joinery. We've used internal joinery. Now is the fun part. The next picture frame we make is going to be kind of cool. Okay, well, we've made 2 frames that went over the basics on how to make picture frames. So now we get to just be creative and make whatever we want to, right? I'm pretty pumped up about this one. We're going to make a frame that looks like it's cracked, like it's cracking, it's coming apart. To do this, you can use whatever species of wood you want. I'm going to use 2 different species. I've got walnut and I have red heart. You can also use bloodwood. Here's how you do this. We're going to layer it. So we need to have a thin layer of a species on top that's going to have the cracks cut into it. And that's going to be glued on top of our bottom layer. In my case, it's going to be walnut. I've already given you the formula for how to figure out the length and the width of your frame, how much material you need. Again, it's the frame width times 2 plus the artwork side minus the Rabbet times 2. Well, I have artwork that is 15 by 15. So in this case, I want a frame that is 1 3/4 wide. So it's gonna be kind of a wide frame. So when I do that math and I calculate my Rabbet in there, then it comes out to 17.5. Now, it's a little bit different than the previous frames because of the artwork I'm putting in there. I'm gonna use this frame for scroll saw art. So I gotta make my frame a bit chunkier. All the process is exactly the same. And another thing is whenever I'm doing mine, I like to have a 1/2 inch wide Rabbet. And the other 2 frames we did before, we did a 1/4 inch. So my frame is gonna be 17.5 inches square. Pretty easy for me, I don't have to worry about any other sizes. Customize this, make it whatever size you want to. Okay, that's the great thing about this one. Since I'm using such a thick artwork panel, I've gotta make my frame a little bit thicker. So I already have 4 pieces of walnut here, rough milled. I need to mill them down a little bit more. I'm gonna mill mine down to 1 inch thick. If I was doing regular artwork, a regular picture like we did before, I would then shoot for 5/8, about 5/8. You could do 3/4, something like that. Basically the same principles that we did for picture frame 1 or picture frame 2, I would do the same thing. Now the way that you do this is you take your contrasting wood, the wood you see on the outside of the frame that has the cracks in it. We need that to be 1/8 inch thick. I said I want a frame that is 1 3/4 wide. So I ripped my pieces down, both the red heart and the walnut, to that plus 1/8 of an inch. So it's really 1 7/8 inch wide. The reason why I did that is because eventually we're gonna glue these on top of each other. You're gonna have some squeeze out, some glue squeeze out and stuff. We need to clean that up a bit. So I'm just giving myself a little bit of room. So once these are glued up and we're all done, then we'll cut it down to 1 3/4. I cut all my pieces to their final lengths as well. Now I said that I wanted to have a picture frame that is 17.5 inches square. So I cut it to that plus 1/8 of an inch. I'm gonna set the walnut pieces off to the side. We don't need those right now. We need to work on those top areas. So I've got my red heart here. I need to make those cracks in it so it looks really cool. Well, to do that, I'm gonna use this scroll saw. I understand that you may not have a scroll saw. If you don't, you could also use a jigsaw. Just know that if you do, you're probably gonna have to make your cracks a little bit wider than what you would do on the scroll saw because the blade is wider. So you might have to do a little bit of modification. I printed off the template for the cracks. I've got the wood. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna apply some contact paper on this. This is just regular contact paper you can get at the store. I think I got this at Target. Really easy stuff to use, not that expensive. Really, really handy when you're doing templates, especially big templates like this. I printed my template off with the frame. So you see the frame sides there. You see the miters on there, not necessary whatsoever. I just wanted to see where those cracks are gonna be at. I kind of count these miters as more of like a rough guideline than a rule. So I'm gonna stick this on my contact paper. To do that, some Super 77, really awesome stuff. Just a couple squirts on the back side of this, put it on there, press it down. Then I recommend putting some packing tape over the top of it. Reason being is that it helps so that your template doesn't fray up as you're cutting. Some people say that it helps to lubricate your blade. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I've never really noticed a difference, honestly, between using it and not using it as far as the blade goes, but I do know that it helps so that my template doesn't accidentally peel off. There are a billion scroll saw blades out there to choose from. So if you're familiar with a scroll saw and you have your favorite blade, just roll with that. If you're not, I'm gonna be using a number 5 reverse tooth blade. So you'll see it says number 5R. It is just a great go-to blade for everything. It cuts dense woods like this. It cuts thicker woods. It gets smooth cuts. It's just overall one of the best types of blades you can get. I feed it through my pilot hole, put the top down, clamp it in place. Once I apply tension, I should be able to hear it kind of like a musical instrument. Now we start cutting and essentially just cut away all the black area. And if for some reason you're cutting and you mess up, no one's gonna know because you're cutting out cracks and cracks are not perfect. So don't put too much pressure on yourself. Not too bad, huh? Put it on top of the walnut. I think that's pretty cool looking. So now it's time to glue this together. I'm just gonna apply some regular Titebond 3 to this. You can use any Titebond you want to. I kind of prefer Titebond 3 just for no particular reason. I got a little roller here. I picked this up at Woodcraft. This is super handy. Now, when you do this, please do not drench this whole thing in glue, because when you do, all that glue is gonna squeeze out right through all of your cracks, and it's gonna ruin the whole appearance of having that really dark look down there. You just need to have enough glue to cover the surface, really, really light. So you don't need to, whenever you push this together, we clamp it together, you don't need to see a ton of squeeze out. That means you got way too much glue. You just have to have glue over the entire surface. So I'm going to apply the glue to our panel, glue it onto the walnut here, and then to make sure we get even clamping pressure, I have a caul. This is simply a piece of MDF, and I'm going to glue them like this, sandwich it. Smash it all together, let it dry for the night, and I've got 3 more to do. Even coverage, that's all you need. You see I don't have it all caked on or anything. That is all we need. Just gonna try to align the edges the best I can and apply a ton of clamps. I know this picture frame class is really comprehensive, but I kind of wonder, is there a way that this could have been even better? Maybe some sort of like interactive activities, puzzles, maybe games, and you play them, and then all of a sudden you know how to make a picture frame without even really realizing you learned anything. If only something like that existed. Well, anyway, let me tell you about today's sponsor, which is Brilliant.org. Brilliant is an interactive learning platform, and it has all these crazy modules in it that let you learn a ton of different things. Math, science, computers, algorithms. It is unbelievable. You can see how gears interact with one another, or the weight ratios whenever you're dealing with pulleys, which is the lesson that I've been taking recently, is because pulleys are kind of fun to play with. They have all these thought experiments and quizzes and games, and you can kind of look at them and just figure out which one you want to do. Does that say diving too fast on the vomit comment? Well, I know which one I'm gonna be playing tonight. In all sincerity, I have told a ton of people way outside of these videos about how much I really like Brilliant and have recommended them to several people that were asking me about things that I knew Brilliant had lessons on. I'm a massive fan of what Brilliant provides, and imagine if we would have had that growing up, how we would have been able to pick up on things way, way faster. That's why I think that it's an excellent idea for kids or grandkids to jump in there and mess around with it, and who knows what you're gonna find interest in. You can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days if you go to brilliant.org/NewtonMakes, or I put some links down in the video description. You can go down there and just check those out. And the first 200 of you that use the link can get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thank you, Brilliant, for supporting this video and, well, just making a really cool place to learn. All our pieces are glued up. I like it. So now I got to cut these to their final size. So as I told you before, I want these to be 1 3/4 inches wide. We did make them a little bit wider than that because there's a little bit of cleanup work that has to get done. So I'm going to do that over the table saw, just trim them to their final size. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut the miters on the ends. For mine, I wanted mine to be 17.5 inches square. So I'm going to cut it to that size. If you have a different size picture frame, cool, cut it to the size that you want. I've got my pieces, the miters are cut. Now we can work on joinery. So it's up to you. You could glue these together and then put a spline in it. We've already talked about how to do that. You could put dowels inside it. We've talked about how to do that. I'm thinking with this one, I want to do a loose mortise and tenon. Now there are 2 ways to do that. If you are fortunate enough to have a festival domino, then this is really easy. You put your domino on there, you drill a hole, you're done. I also understand that that is a really expensive tool and not everyone has one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a loose mortise and tenon, but I'm going to do it over at the router table and show you how to do that for miter joints. Over at the router table, I put 2 stop blocks on my fence. So I've got one here that says a 45-degree angle. The other one is just a 90-degree angle. I do have a 45-degree angle on the other side, my waist side over here. I'll tell you why in a minute. Now here's what we do. We are going to ride our piece down this 45 into our blade, go over until we hit this stop block, lift it up, and we're done. It might be hard to tell on here because of the color of my bit. I have a dark colored bit. This is a 1/4 inch spiral bit that I have in my router, and I have it about 3/4 of an inch tall. So what I have to make sure I'm doing though, is I gotta make sure that the fence is moved so that the router bit is gonna be cutting in the middle of my workpiece. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm shooting for the middle if I can. The key to really making this cut is to ensure that you're not going to cut it so that you poke out the side of your picture frame here, and that you don't cut too far and pop out the inside or cut through your rabbet. So what I did was I took a marker and I marked where my rabbet is gonna be at. And I wanna make sure this stop block is set so that whenever I push this workpiece forward, and it hits the stop block, I'm looking at the bit here, and I'm making sure that the bit does not get past my line. So I want to make sure I'm cutting from the tip to the line, don't go past the line. So that's how I set this stop block. For this one over here, what I'm going to do is I set the stop block where I think it might be, kind of glide this down, and just make sure that as I'm gliding it down, this bit is not higher than my workpiece. And I can see that it is not higher. You can't see that bit. It's all hidden behind the workpiece. I know I'm good. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to cut all of these on this end. So I'm gonna cut all my pieces, push them over, cut all 4 pieces this way. Then I gotta cut the other side of my fence, now my frame. What I can't do though, is do it this way. Because the odds are me having this bit dead on, 100% perfect, right in the middle, probably a little bit low. So if I were to cut one side with my top facing out, the other side with the bottom facing out, whenever I put my joint together, those slots will probably not line up. That's the reason why this one over here is at a 45-degree angle. So after I cut all of these, I started to cut the other side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip these blocks around. I'm going to flip this around so that there's a 45-degree angle pointing this way, flip this one around so there's 90 degrees. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to slide it down and push it forward. I'm making a climb cut, so please take caution. We are cutting and pushing the workpiece opposite of the traditional way that you would push a workpiece on a router table. So It's something that is doable. People do it, but please take caution whenever you try this. I made some little tenons for our slots. This is just a maple that I had in the shop. It's just some scrap wood. This is great for scraps. It's a 1/4 inch thick, and I cut it into a little rectangle here, and it fits into my slot. And I got to make sure that my joint closes, and it does. It even lets you slide it around just a bit to make sure your joint is lined up the way it is supposed to be. All right, before I glue this together though, I'm going to go ahead and put the rabbet on the inside faces of my pieces. Now we did go over how you could do a rabbet afterwards using a rabbeting bit. So you have that option. So you can glue this together, the whole thing, go to the router table and do that. I'm going to go ahead to the table saw, use a ripping blade, cut my rabbets, then glue the whole thing together. After the frame was dry, I took it out of the clamps and sanded the entire thing down, all the surfaces, and I have to say, I really like it. So that's gonna be really cool. I can't wait to figure out what scroll saw product is gonna go inside this. I've got some ideas, but I wanna kind of play it by ear. So at this point, I would apply finish to it. So if you made this, you would apply finish, and apply whatever finish works best for you. Oil, a varnish, lacquer, whatever, shellac, whatever. I'm not going to apply finish to this. Typically I would, but I want to do the scroll saw project first, figure out what finish I'm going to apply to that, and I'll apply the same finish to the frame. So for mine, it's done. I'll set it over here to the side. You can finish up yours. There you have it, a whole bunch of different ways to make a picture frame, all the techniques and tools and all of that. So hopefully now you can get in your shop and build something awesome. Diving too fast in the vomit comment.